This is one in a series of joint programs that has been put together by the Non-Proliferation Policy Education Center, NPEC, and the American Bar Standing Committee on Law and National Security. The topic of tonight's gathering is, as you know, what is America's obligation to avert targeting power reactors, the role of nuclear power plants in the law of armed conflict. I think it's particularly a topic of concern because I'm sure most of you have heard earlier this afternoon, Evgeny Prigozhin appears to have died in a plane crash 10 miles outside of Moscow. So unclear what the source of the trouble for the plane was, but it's, I would say, clear to say that Putin has demonstrated that he will take serious measures if he concerns he's being threatened. So the question tonight is part of what is the role of international law and the role of the law of war manual that we have in the United States and how it approaches this issue of interpreting additional Protocol 1 of 1977 and additional Protocol 2 if it's applicable. And what are sort of the legal approach that the IHL has and whether or not the United States concurs and what our particular approach is in interpreting these particular doctrines in the context of the targeting of nuclear power plants. Tonight's agenda, we're very, very lucky to have Gary Korn, currently Director of Technology, Law, and Security Program at American University. For many of us, you know him as having been the SJAG at Cybercom for a number of years, quite an authority on the law of armed conflict. And he will begin with his presentation, I think, laying out the interpretation that I think the U.S. has of Protocol 1 and Protocol 2 and the obligations. This will be followed by Henry. I don't think Henry actually per se needs an introduction. Henry, as you know, is the executive director of the NPEC and has been writing on this issue for a number of months now and has helped bring it to the attention of a number of policy people. Then we will open it up to questions. And the first question I think we will reserve for Ren Gady. He's the General Counsel at DoD for Intelligence and recently stepped down from being the General Counsel of DIA and also is a friend of our committee, the ABA, and as Gary is a member of our committee and the Standing Committee. And Henry is not a lawyer, but a close friend. He's an amicus of our committee, given his interest in these issues that have legal policy impact. So with that, I will be timely, Gary, and let you start and kick off the evening. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Harvey. Thanks for the invitation to join this discussion. It's kind of interesting, the number of law of war or IHL issues that I would say were not front burner issues prior to February of last year have sort of become more relevant as conflict always rears its head in different ways. And, you know, just as one example, the whole notion of the concept of a levée en masse, you know, where civilian populations rise up in the face of an invasion and their status under the law of war. This is something that was almost considered anachronistic until suddenly we saw things happening, you know, when Russia escalated in February of last year. And obviously, you know, their actions in relation to the nuclear power plant in Ukraine, you know, I think from a military operational perspective, we would look at that and think that that's kind of really stupid. And sometimes just stupidity is the bulwark against some of these things. But Russia has shown itself to be almost entirely unconstrained by the rules that it has accepted as binding on it under international law. So, you know, we start with Additional Protocol 1. Russia is a party to Additional Protocol 1. Doesn't seem to have factored in very significantly to its operational activities in a variety of fronts that we've seen. And operations against civilians, attacks, et cetera, and certainly operations with respect to the nuclear power plant. Additional Protocol 1, obviously, and 2, Additional Protocol 1 is a treaty. I think the current number of states that are party to Additional Protocol 1 is 174, which is pretty significant. There are a few less that are parties to Additional Protocol 2. The first protocol is applicable only to armed conflict between states. It's international armed conflict. It has to involve 2 or more states to be triggered. It's a much more fulsome body of rules that are contained in Additional Protocol 1 and the 4 Geneva Conventions of 1949, et cetera. Additional Protocol 2 is the set of rules that are applicable to non-international armed conflicts. Traditionally, we would think of civil war post September 11th. That view has changed substantially, certainly for our Supreme Court, where any armed conflict resort to hostilities between non-state entities and other non-state entities, or with a state, such as our conflicts with Al Qaeda and ISIS, et cetera, are non-international armed conflicts. Now, the U.S. is not a party to either Additional Protocol 1 or Additional Protocol 2. I think it's important to state up front, the reason that the U.S. has not ratified either protocol is not because of the provisions in Article 56 of Additional Protocol 1 and a corresponding provision in Protocol 2 that deal with attacks or protections of installations containing dangerous forces, which would include nuclear power plants. I'll get into the U.S.'s view of what the law says about that, but its objection to Additional Protocol 1 and 2 overall, it really has nothing to do with Article 56. It's an entirely different question about how the additional protocols give essentially state-like status to non-state entities in certain types of conflicts, wars of independence from colonial domination, et cetera, and certain specific provisions with respect to how you classify those who are considered combatants and entitled to prisoner of war status in a conflict to non-state actors. And the U.S. felt that that was fatally flawed and was created risk to the basic core principle of distinction in armed conflict, right? Separating civilians from combatants, those who have the privilege to engage in hostilities and those who don't, and whether you can conduct operations against the combatants and not the civilians. So that's the real issue that the U.S. has had with Additional Protocol 1 primarily. The U.S. has recognized that a significant number of the provisions of both Protocol 1 and Protocol 2 are reflective of customary international law. And if the U.S. acknowledges something as a binding rule of customary international law, then it's acknowledging that it is bound by that rule. So now if you focus in on the question of dangerous forces, there's no question that Additional Protocol 1 has a rule that creates a higher standard for being able to conduct attacks against certain installations, dams, dikes, nuclear power plants, electricity generating nuclear power plants. It's kind of interesting, in the negotiations for Additional Protocol 1, there were some efforts to include a broader set of installations that might qualify, and those were rejected. The states that negotiated the protocol limited it very down to those basic 3 categories, but set essentially a almost irrebuttable presumption against being able to target nuclear power plants, dikes, dams, or enemy forces, military objectives that are co-located or located in the vicinity of those installations. It is not an absolute rule. There are exceptions to the rule, but the way those are set out, it's very difficult to envision how in a targeting process you'd be able to meet one of those exceptions. So this rule builds on and is much more restrictive than what we would say the normal targeting rules and structures are in the law of armed conflict. So in a nutshell, we know that the law of armed conflict requires that those who are engaging in attacks, that is, acts of violence against the adversary, must distinguish between, as I said earlier, combatants and civilians, and are prohibited from directing attacks intentionally against civilians. Not all objects, there are objects that are civilian in nature. They may start out civilian. They can be subject to a test of the law of war, converted, we say, into military objectives. That is, something that by its nature, location, use, or purpose provides a concrete advantage to the adversary, and whose total or partial destruction would provide a military advantage to the attacker. Once you've made that assessment and determined that something is a military objective, unless there are incidental concerns, collateral damage concerns, then you can strike that target. If there are reasonably expected incidental harms, then you have to go through a proportionality analysis and assess whether or not that incidental harm would be excessive in relation to the direct and concrete military advantage that you would gain from striking the target. So, as an example, you can take a civilian bridge. It is civilian, it's protected, but if, because of its location, it's going to provide a main route to cross a river and an axis of advance to the enemy, we see that bridges are nominated as targets and struck frequently for that reason. So that's not unlawful to strike that bridge, and then you have to engage in a proportionality analysis, and a series of what we say precautions in the attack is essentially due diligence to determine, to verify that the target is in fact a lawful target, and that you're not going to be causing excessive collateral harm, incidental harm, etc. That is where the U.S. position is in terms of Article 56. If you look in the Law of War Manual, the U.S. position has been from the beginning that it did not view there to be sufficient evidence that the rule as articulated in Article 56 is reflective of customary international law. It doesn't mean that the U.S. would disagree with it as a matter of good policy. What it means is the U.S. doesn't see that it has a legal obligation to adhere to the strict provisions of Article 56. And interestingly, even the International Committee for the Red Cross, if you look at their customary international law study, doesn't view the rule as a customary international rule to be as strict as the one set out in Additional Protocol 1. So, the U.S. basically considers that the normal targeting rules should be the rules to be followed in considering whether or not to strike an entity that is considered a dangerous release of dangerous forces, or the risk of release of dangerous forces. You can envision, for example, a dam. We've seen this happen to grave effect in Ukraine. You can envision a dam that also has a major roadway crossing the top of it, not unheard of. And just as a bridge, that may become a very critical point of disrupting the adversary's ability to move and maneuver. And having said that, the Law of War Manual acknowledges very much that when you're considering the risks of incidental harm and the nature and the scope, et cetera, you can't ignore the facts that are present in striking a particular entity. So there are unique concerns with respect to striking a nuclear facility or conducting operations in or near in the vicinity of a nuclear facility that absolutely have to be considered in the normal targeting process and structure. That is, again, not quite as strict as is laid out in Article 56. And I think the U.S. position for some time has been that although there's probably rare instances where those strikes would even meet a regular targeting approval, the nature of the rule as is written is inconsistent with operational imperatives in certain circumstances. So, not only the U.S., but the U.K., France, and some other countries, even though they are signatories to Additional Protocol 1, they signed with reservations that were very clear that they could not sign up to an absolute rule, which is essentially what Article 56 sets out. So there's a lot of ways to unpack Article 56. We can get into that in the questioning. The other point I'll get to is, you have to look at this as well through the lens. It's a fair criticism to say that policy is as malleable as clay, right? But we have longstanding policy and procedures about how we implement targeting, et cetera. And if you look at the collateral damage estimate methodology that we employ, if you look at the sensitive target assessment and review processes that we employ, I will just say that in my experience, the likelihood that anyone lower than multi-stars on their lapels or even higher would be delegated the authority to make the decision to strike a nuclear facility is slim to none. So, that's just further recognition of the sensitivity of these entities. And so the position with respect to Article 56 isn't reflective of a cavalier approach to taking action against something like this. It's reflective, again, of the two pieces. One, if we don't believe there's sufficient evidence that something is a matter of customary international law, then as a matter of law, we can't say we're bound by it. And two, it's good policy to restrict ourselves, but we have to recognize the realities of potential future conflicts and the operational imperatives that may be at play. So, I'll hold there, Henry, and I know we're going to turn it over.
Thank you, Gary. So for the question period, the issue, Gary, is it the American position, U.S. position, that the striking of a nuclear power plant per se is not a war crime? I'll let you mull that over.
I could take at least.
But I'm sure we'll now move to the policy position. So, Henry, why don't you give a policy perspective?
Lawyer for the ex-lawyer. He's an establishment guy.
Okay. First, let me say that with the last set of comments, you can tell the amount of difference in principle between what Gary and I have to say may not be great, but I think I will make the case that because of the last comments, the recommendations I make ought to be easy and pleasant and welcome to take on. I think the arguments that you've just heard all make sense, and they especially make sense if you don't know much about reactors and you have a sense of military science that was prevalent when this thing was negotiated roughly a half century ago. But that in light of recent events, it would be wise to adjust some of the unnecessarily open-ended language in interpreting our obligations as a signatory. And although we're not a party We are someone that signed it, and that it has a certain residual sense of obligation, which I think actually is reflected in the manual and its commentary at times. I think it could be clear. I guess what I'm going to make the general case for is that we all need to be just slightly a bit more Aristotelian or Talmudic, and that is to say, aware of the ethical dimensions of things that change. And I think things have changed a little, and I'll make that case, and that we need to adjust some of the language that we use in the manual to reflect that, because my hunch is the calls that I would make and that Gary would make in every instance, I bet you would be identical. And that should be kept in mind as I proceed. Okay. I think one of the difficulties I see with the way in which we explain our obligations or how we see our policies reflective of the signature on Protocol 1 is that those views and policies are more in line with Putin's views than with our allies. I think that's a bit of a problem. Now, clearly, Russia has behaved very badly on this front. It has physically hit research reactors in Ukraine. It has, hit things that have disabled Zaporizhia for quite some time at swaths. It has put offensive military units on the site. It has fired very close and fired over other reactors. We don't want to condone that behavior. And I think everyone would agree that we don't. But when you read how we interpret what we're allowed to do as we see it, it kind of gets very murky as to what the difference between our views and Russia's are. Now, I don't think Russia is stupid in attacking these things, by the way. There is a institute that studies war that had lots of material on how Putin and his military advisors saw leveraging various political and military and diplomatic objects by firing in different ways at these things. I don't think it was just stupidity. That's not a complete thought. Now, most of America's allies have ratified protocol. Of course, the U.S. hasn't. But you have the UK, the European Union, and Germany's foreign and military ministers have said that the strikes against Ukrainian infrastructure in Zaporizhia are war crimes. On this point, for the reasons laid out, I think already, the U.S. has been silent. But it goes further. I think we not only didn't quite have clear-throated support for the Allies' view with regard to the criminality of Russia's actions, but when you take a look at the manual, ultimately, in a kind of elliptical fashion, the section concludes with a remark that ultimately it's not bound by the prescriptions of Protocol 1, and that there might be cases where it would be proportionate to risk and maybe even make occur a significant release of radiation that would cause maybe even severe harm to innocents. It would be warranted if the commander deemed the conduct of such an attack was necessary to achieve an important military objective. Now, to the manual's credit, elsewhere it notes that that objective, that military objective, determining how important it was and what was severe harm, both are subjective calls. And I think that's right. So why should we care about this? I think it kind of, this murkiness, this reservation of an option, which I think, as Gary points out, would be very unlikely to be exercised, gives the Pentagon, it gives Russia, North Korea, and China a bit more of a pretext to do as the Pentagon allows, at least in speech, to strike nuclear power plants, even though it might release dangerous amounts of radiation. Now, we had a war game, NPEC, with Mariana was involved. I think had a Romanian, and we had someone Polish. We had someone from NATO. And one of the interesting problems in the game, which was not anticipated by the designer, that would be me, was that there was a real stumble with regard to how the Allies viewed Russian attacks on NATO reactors and Ukrainian reactors. They saw it as a war crime. We didn't. And it caused Poland and Ukraine to want to bolt and attack Russia. And we had to use Article 5, not to deter Russia, but to deter Poland from acting, which is kind of perverse, but it suggests why it might be useful to close, to the extent possible, not entirely, the differences in views between the American lawyers and the European NATO lawyers. Also, I mean, this might be impossible to prove, but there's a part of me that wants to believe this, and I think there's a part of all of us that wants to believe it. And that is that holding people accountable to certain prescriptions in war might be useful, particularly if your enemy is losing and they know it. There's a lengthy historiography about the Nazi decision not to destroy Paris, which is very murky, I got to tell you. But in the murk, there's this notion that the key general did not want to be held accountable for destroying it, and he knew that would be wrong at various levels. I think you want to be able to be in a position to exercise that prospect at all times, even if it is, not demonstrable or provable in every instance. I think also a proper interpretation of our obligations to avoid targeting reactors in a way that would release a lot of radioactivity would help put China, who also ratified it, on the defensive, because unlike Japan, South Korea, and Taiwan, who have no plans to attack their neighbors' power reactors, we have some documentation that shows China does. And we also know that in the cases of our allies, they have the IEA verifying that they're not making tritium or plutonium at the machines. Chinese don't. And I think just by spotlighting these differences without saying a word of threat, it would imply that China's reactors are legitimate targets, and that, break my heart, maybe Beijing would have to spend a lot of money on air defenses and doesn't currently. That would be good. So how might we close the gap, as I say, between how others view their obligations and we, to avoid targeting these reactors? Well, you could try to ratify Protocol 1, but I think Gary makes a really good case that that's a suicide mission. So I wouldn't recommend that. You could have the president announce declaratory policy, which I think in the case of this president and probably the next would be challenging, and it would be transitory. There would be this will for each administration possibly to reverse, whatever the previous president does. It's childish, but there's where we are. That's the reason why I think updating the language in the Law of War Manual might be not only the most feasible, but maybe even the most desirable. Now, any update, I think, would want to highlight this very fundamental thing, that the military science, particularly associated with aiming accuracies, and our experience in Ukraine demonstrate in ways not apparent a half century ago that one can readily and reliably disable a nuclear power plant without risking significant radiation releases. These new developments make it much easier to endorse Protocol 1's admonition that when there's a choice, I think we now have more choices. It's possible between several military objectives for obtaining a military advantage. The objective should be selected that the attack be the one that causes the least danger. Can we put up the slides? I'm just going to race through why we really have come a long way since the mid-70s. Can we get the, yeah, okay, let's go to the first chart. This is one of my favorite ones. You know, during the Second World War, certainly in the beginning, half of the bombs dropped on any given point target could only get within 75 square miles. That resulted in these scenes all over Europe and a good part of Japan, where to destroy the point target, you had to destroy the entire city. And we did. Well, let's go to the next chart. In Vietnam, we got better. We came within slightly less than a square mile. That meant that half of the bombs got within got slightly less than a square mile of the target, and the others, you know, went everywhere. That's when we negotiated protocol. Let's go to the next slide. What are the implications of that level of accuracy? Well, even after Vietnam, when strikes were made against many reactors in the Middle East, it was a binary proposition. You either decimated the target or you missed it. And this explains, you know, a great deal of the history of the 70s, mostly the 80s and the 90s. Let's go to the next slide. Where are we now? Well, at least in theory, people have been arguing that we would be able to do this for many decades. Now we can. It is possible to have 100% of the bombs come within less than 1 meter of the target. The driver in this case walked away unharmed. The terrorist in the rear seat did not do so well. What are the implications of that with regard to reactors? Let's go to the next slide. Well, you'll see these boxes, and you can cause a loss of coolant accident by targeting one or more of these things. You know, actually trying to get to the nuclear island through the containment building. It's possible to do with tandem munitions. That containment building, concrete, contrary to urban legend, is somewhere in the neighborhood of 100 psi. That is not that difficult to penetrate with proper munitions that are readily available to the major powers and their friends. The control room, the steam generating pipes in between certainly can be used to cause a loss of coolant, blah, blah, blah. The diesel emergency generators, if you also cut off the power grid lines, you could possibly get a loss of coolant. What would that look like? Well, we modeled it in the case of the plant at Corey, and you can see, depending on which way the wind's blowing, it's a 6-month pattern one way, a 6-month pattern the other. You know, it could cause anything orange and red would be a mandatory evacuation. That's millions of people. No, it would not be the case that there would be deaths, although maybe cancer incidences would go up. But that would be a real blow to the real estate market, if you know what I mean. And you would not be able to come back. Not for months, not for years, but decades. I think that's a lot of damage. Governments have fallen as a result of these kinds of problems. Now, if you hit a spent fuel pond, that's down below, well, it's Chernobyl time, and you can see the patterns there. Let's go to, now, so you can do that with precision, but here's the next slide. You can also disable a plant with virtually no prospect of radiological release by focusing on the transformers, the outbound tower lines, and the electrical generators. If you go to the next slide, this isn't so much theory. We're getting this in practice. If you try to understand what's going on with some of the plants, and particularly Zaporizhia, these things have been done. Now, let's wrap up here. You know, I think this point about the change in accuracy was made in the Air Force pamphlet on targeting doctrine. And I see no reason why it cannot and shouldn't be repeated in the Pentagon's treatment of the topic. And what they pointed out is that what is proportionate roughly has changed because the inaccuracies of World War II are no longer, thankfully. I think we need to observe that. And then I think that would then change this piece of language that we currently have. You know, having our military make targeting, timing, and weaponeering decisions to reduce the prospects of the release of dangerous forces should read would be appropriate. Right now, the language is may be appropriate. I think that's way too squishy and silly. I think we can go to would be appropriate. The reason I use may is it takes you off the hook a bit. There's no need to do that. Attacks against offensive military assets based at reactors, as Protocol 1 notes, you know, may be legitimate targets if proper care is taken to avoid the release of dangerous forces. I think this ought to be the gravamon. We spend far too much time in that manual worrying about, you know, the law of war theories of proportionality. If you do not release dangerous forces, you do not need to get into the proportionality calculation because you don't release the forces. The balance is pretty, you know, when it's close to 0-0, makes the proportionality problem set evaporate. I think for that reason, if there is a fear that you're going to, because you don't have precision munitions or you're going after items very close to the nodes that might release radiation, we should follow the Air Force targeting guidance, which is available. They don't say go to the commander or the commander above you or the 2 button. They say you should seek a national decision at an appropriate high policy level. I think we should say that, and I'll tell you why. I think potentially with the kinds of radiological releases that might occur, you're talking about something akin to the release authority for a tactical nuclear weapon. That goes to the president. I mean, I would think you would treat this with a little bit more clarity as to how serious a thing it is. We're protecting, again, an option not to go in that direction. There's no need to go that we don't need to preserve that option. And then finally, the stipulation in Protocol 1 that, you know, you can only hit the target, the reactor, if, you know, it's producing electricity and making an effective contribution to military action, blah, blah, blah. I think this is technically correct, but it ignores other places in Protocol 1 where common sense prevails, and it says a military objective is one that makes an effective contribution. And therefore, whether the thing is producing electricity that is in irregular, significant, and direct support of other military operations should not be the only way to look at whether or not it's a legitimate target. I think it's quite clear that if it's producing tritium and we can demonstrate to our satisfaction that it is, or plutonium to make nuclear weapons, it's a legitimate military target. And I don't think Protocol 1 should be allowed to prevent that. And we can, by declaration, say that's the way we view it. So those are my recommendations, and I look forward to everyone's questions and comments.
Thank you, Henry. So, Gary, I'll let you respond first about Henry's sort of wordsmithing of how we would interpret AP1 and get your reaction.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a lot to unpack. I think from the outset, though, we have to be careful about understanding what the DoD Law of War Manual is and what it is not. Okay, and I'd have to look at the Air Force document you're referencing, but as a matter of how we manage risk in targeting, there are already procedures. Often they are classified because it's like rules of engagement. We don't announce those necessarily, but that absolutely would require targets of this level of sensitivity to be raised to extremely high levels for approval. But that's a policy determination unless it's a legal obligation. But the Law of War Manual, which is a document written by the Department of Defense for the Department of Defense, it is explaining the DoD's views about what the law is. Whether or not that is consonant with national level views, one would hope most of the time, but there have been some points of disagreement over certain things. And we just saw, for example, some revisions to the DoD Law of War Manual where the current General Counsel, through internal coordination, et cetera, has said, I view the law slightly differently, and we're going to reflect that, for example, in how we apply a presumption as to whether someone is a civilian as opposed to a combatant, et cetera. So, we can't write into a law manual policy directives and in the form of rules of engagement or other delegation withholdings for targeting. That just doesn't, it's the wrong place to place that. Now, the change of would to may or may to would, I honestly don't know that would really make much of a difference. But that's the kind of thing that, you'll get the department lawyers poring over for hours and hours to make sure they're comfortable with it, no doubt. But I honestly don't think that would have such a great impact. And interestingly, in some sense, much of what you laid out in terms of the increased accuracy in our weapons capability and targeting capability, I think cuts in a different direction. To your point, if you are able to, and the manual says, weaponeering is appropriate. Weaponeering is something we do in order.
May be appropriate,
but it's.
I mean,
Yeah, no.
yeah,
But
let him finish, and then I'll
Okay.
let him finish.
Henry, the reason for that is because weaponeering is one aspect of implementation of legal obligations, which the direct and concrete military advantage to be gained. Military necessity is always a component that is balanced against the humanitarian concerns. It's a thread that's woven through the entirety of the law of armed conflict. Okay, and so that's all that's conveying there is, I would say in most circumstances, you always weaponeer. We have policies for that. That's a way of avoiding the creation of anticipated incidental harm that you would then have to balance against that military advantage. And interestingly, even Article 56 only prohibits the striking of the installations with the risk of dangerous forces. Shall be where these objects are military objectives. So it's already assuming that they're military objectives, right? It's already assuming that it's putting a higher level of control. If such an attack may cause the release of dangerous forces and consequent severe losses to the civilian population. So if you're able to weaponeer with weapons technology to disable the power generation of a nuclear power plant, you wouldn't even be in breach of Article 56.
Well, I think okay.
Right. So I mean, that
do you have any other points?
You're going to get to that same place.
Yeah.
Under either analysis, if you're relying on the weapons technology. The broader point is we have become quite enamored and dependent on our weapons technology, but it isn't necessarily always going to be available. And that's an operational reality that has to be taken into account
Okay.
before signing up to burdensome legal obligations that aren't necessarily reflective of customary international law.
Okay, so Henry, I
Okay.
think either, I don't know if you want to briefly stop because I'd like to get more people into the
No,
conversation.
no, I'm sorry. I would like to make one rejoinder and then we'll open it up. I think this is unnecessary squeamishness, because if you take a look at the manual, it does make a number of comments about what is clear legally and what isn't. And therefore, I don't see that, making the point that, it would be appropriate to do something rather than saying, well, in some instances, you're free not to. The thing is spring loaded with this concern about the subjectivity of extreme harm. It does not put any burden on the subjectivity of making the determination of the military importance. I don't think you can resolve that, and I'm not suggesting you eliminate that. I'm just saying that's a black box, and that we need to be highlighting at least as much as the Air Force doctrine pamphlet does, which is dealing with the law, but it's Air Force. I think we can follow their lead, and what I wonder about is why Abe Sofair, of all folks, is brought in to make a proportionality argument so late in the day, this revision in July, when that kind of concern is less and less present, given the advance of military science and the elimination of the premise of the release of dangerous forces in any proper weaponeering and for targeting prospect if you knew much about reactors. I mean, it just seems there's something else going on here. It would be useful not to look like anything is going on. And if there was a way to clarify it, and I think there is, we should make some effort.
So let me sum up. I see this as, I would say that, Gary, you are of the opinion that the current language suffices and it gives enough flexibility for the decision maker in the context of what their understanding of military necessity is. I see the position being put forward by Henry that you'd like to see a little bit more restrictive language and more understanding of per se actions that would be considered a violation of both international law and our law of armed conflict.
I wouldn't make this a legal point as much. I think we'd just
but-
say that in pursuit of this, when they say weaponeering, it shouldn't be, oh, well, you might be able to do this. You should try to do it.
Well, we call in the law the least restrictive means. That's what
Right.
lawyers would know
There
of
you
how that would be sort of put into the analysis. But with that, the protocol should be rules of engagement. At the bottom of your screen, you can see a raised hand. So I encourage you all to want to jump in to raise your hand through the screen, and I'll be able to recognize you and do it in order. But to start the evening, I thought I'd call Ren Gady. And Ren, I'm sure you've listened to this conversation and thought if you have any questions or comments that you hope would clarify what the issue is.
I thought that Henry did a great job of explicating the policy portions. I'm sorry I had to step out for a part of that. I think Gary did a great job of explaining the DoD position, by the way. This is a really important topic, I think, that needs to be discussed, as evidenced by what we're seeing in the news on a regular basis. I will note that the DoD Law of War Manual is intended to be regularly updated, and it's in the process of being done so right now. To Gary's point, and this is more of a statement and perhaps maybe a question at the end for Henry, the U.S. position was based on the regular application of the principles of proportionality are not customary international law and provide sufficient protection. If you take a look at the famous, if you would, Matheson statement, as it relates to Article 56, it says that severe losses would result. If severe losses would result, then the attack is forbidden. no matter how important the target. So that comes back to the weaponeering decision, certainly, that Henry is talking about. And Henry's discussion of the release of nuclear contamination would certainly, it would seem like, result in severe losses. Henry, would that be sufficient with that understanding that is widely known, the Matheson statement about Article 56 be sufficient for your purposes here? Over.
I'm not familiar with the statement, but I certainly am still willing to allow, someone to do something really bad and maybe, release those forces. But boy, it should not simply be made, that decision, by a commander. It should be put over to the political overlords of the military, because they are stepping onto some very dicey ice. And I don't care how many buttons the military commander has. That, I think, is probably a presidential decision. And the Matheson statement sounds good. I just don't. I don't know much about it, so I shouldn't be, ruling, if you will. But I think we're preserving options that are just increasingly so remote that you wonder what the motive is.
So I think one of the issues for Hawley and Caperton, a number of documents have been referenced in the conversation. I think it'd be helpful if we sent those documents out to the individuals on the call now, so they'll be able to look at them afterwards if we plan to produce any sort of white paper or short policy paper from the discussion. Marianne, you've been very, very patient. Why don't you join the conversation?
Thank you all so much. Thank you for including me in this conversation. And Gary, I appreciate your briefing. I learned a lot, actually. It has received wisdom in our field that, the reason why U.S. has not signed up to or has not ratified the protocols is precisely to preserve the option for the non-proliferation policy of kind of disabling nascent nuclear infrastructure and so forth. And you've clarified that very nicely. So a couple of comments here. One, we're working, I suppose, on the presumption here that strengthening and clarifying the law for this country, the guidance for this country's sort of way of dealing with these type of targets will somehow translate in the strengthening of an overall international norm, whether formal or informal, leading by example, setting setting it out and thinking about it in a good sort of detailed manner, hoping that the bad guys will somehow be constrained by it going forward. I think that's a fair presumption, but we've seen a country like Russia basically break every single international norm, including the ones they have been part of creating, of signing up to, and so forth. But that being said, I think it is still very important for this country to think about, where we stand on that. I'm also wondering what exactly do we mean by the targeting of nuclear power plants and the danger of releasing nuclear forces? What is it that statement really entails in a facility like a nuclear power plant? Because as Henry alluded to in one of his slides, actually, the precision weaponry could matter very little in the case where you just take the grid out. The security of a nuclear power plant depends on three things: power, water, and people. You take away the power, you don't have to touch that power plant at all. You just cut off offsite power to it. Then you got 10 to 12 days for diesel generators at current rules. Then you got 3 hours before the fuel starts melting down. If any of the reactors work at any capacity, then you got 5 more hours before the actual steel container in which the fuel is starts melting down. Then you got another 10 hours before that seeps through the concrete structure and goes into the groundwater. In Ukraine case, it's in Dnipro, and then it's in the Black Sea. So Henry, were you trying to?
Yeah, Henry, are you trying to mutter or something? You're muttering.
That all is true if you're foolish enough to hit the inbound power lines. If you hit the outbound power lines, none of that applies. The plant shut down. True. Well, I tried to make that point and that distinction, and you can make that distinction if you know anything about the grid and you're looking at the photos properly.
So, Marianne, why don't you finish your thought?
Yeah.
So what I'm saying is, targeting a nuclear power plant perhaps needs to be specified as to what exactly do we include in the targeting concept, because not a single missile, no matter how precise, has to even touch that plant in order for there to be an immense danger of a nuclear meltdown.
So let me ask this to Gary then. Yeah. So Marianne, following your logic, Gary and Marianne, should we be saying that if you're going to target a nuclear power plant per se, if you are targeting the output of the energy, which leaves the plant sustainable and not a danger, versus targeting the power going into the plant, which then, as Marianne put it, sets off a clock as to when the plant becomes dangerous, should that be per se a violation of the law of armed conflict?
It's presently not under Article 56, even under the stricter standard of Article 56. And you look at the commentaries to the protocol, et cetera. As I said, unless if you're going to make the facility the object of the attack, and I'll come back to that, but assuming you're going to conduct a strike on the facility or a component of the facility, if you can do so in a way that you can determine it will not release the dangerous forces, you're not in violation of Article 56.
Right.
So, and that's the same would be true under a normal targeting analysis, because there you don't anticipate, reasonably anticipate incidental harm caused by your operation, or at least not the type of harm that we're talking about here that would more than likely be excessive in almost any circumstance in relation to the direct and concrete advantage to be gained by your operation. So now there's also within 56, there's an obligation, we call it passive precautions, where whoever is in control of that facility is not supposed to be placing military forces or military objective targets around the facility, except for the defense of the facility. And that, though, doesn't create that. The fact that an adversary will do that doesn't lift the obligation not to strike those targets. If striking them would involve that risk of unleashing the dangerous forces. And so you can see there's a bit of a perverse structure in there that would incentivize the lesser evil of stationing your forces so that they're protected. If you know your adversary is not going to strike those forces under the stricter construct of Article 56.
Yeah.
Stephanie,
by the way,
so I have one more point to make.
And then Stephanie's going to jump in next.
And then, I'll cede the floor. So, as I said, power, water, and people. What we're seeing, one of the biggest dangers at Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant today is people, is the way they've been treated. You take away the people, you still have power, you still have water, you release dangerous forces. So is there a legal way to protect the operating licensed staff of a nuclear power plant as some sort of separate category of custodians that are essential staff in order to make to keep these dangerous forces contained. I mean, today there are reactors that don't have at Zaporizhzhia a single licensed operator on them. Granted, they're in cold shutdown, some of them, but eventually people who are being tortured, who are being working under the barrel of the gun, they're going to leave. And then who's going to operate them? Is there a way to imbue these people with a special legal status under international law? I don't know, like diplomatic passports. I have no idea. In order to recognize that without these people, even if you take over the plant, they need to be somehow protected.
I mean, we certainly have in the law of armed conflict special statuses, for medical personnel, et cetera, that hopefully gives them increased protection. But I would say this: civilians are protected, and the people working in these facilities, they're not military facilities; they're civilian facilities that may provide some military benefit in the terms of providing power generation, et cetera, for your military forces and installations. They are still civilians, no different than civilians that work in a munitions factory. And so you couldn't target the civilians as civilians. What you'd be doing is like having to consider them as incidental harm if you're attacking the facility, right? And so, yes, I could understand where a non-law abiding state would see that the mechanism to achieve the effect of degradation of power generation is to just kill the workers, right? But that's already that's a war crime. So I don't know that that's a mechanism to.
So then, Gary, why do we give enhanced status to medical? Because they too are civilians.
Yeah, but it also, well, they're not necessarily civilians. Oftentimes they're the specific category of, and I know this gets confusing, but non-combatants, which are military medical personnel, but who serve exclusively for the provision of medical treatment, et cetera. And that status has more to do with than just whether you can target them. It has to do with if they're captured, are they prisoners of war or are they retained personnel? What can they be made to do? When should they be released? There's a whole series of other protections that come along with that special status, which, it's an interesting idea. I don't know that it would provide much more than you're talking about here, and especially as well, certainly if you follow Article 56 logic, if you take out the civilians for the purpose of causing the plant to fail, there's a good chance that failure could result in the release of the very dangerous forces that you're not supposed to cause. So I don't know that that's going to change a whole lot.
Yeah.
I
think
Stephanie,
Harvey,
Henry, I'd like to have Stephanie get involved, and then
well,
you can
okay.
Stephanie, why don't you?
Wait a minute. No.
Henry,
Hold on just 1 second. I mean, I think the point that was raised by Mariana is important, but I don't think it should be classified and that you and forbidden for you to put a footnote distinguishing between the means of disabling a plant that don't release and some that do. I mean, you can give it a heuristic. It is missing there. It is just missing in action.
Well, I think Gary recognized it's an idea. The question is, how do you actually operationalize it to be
well,
significant?
if you take a look at the footnotes, some of them are a little bit beyond just legal.
Well, that's fine.
Right.
Stephanie, why don't you jump in? Stephanie, you're still on mute. Stephanie, you have to unmute.
Sorry. There I am. Okay, sorry about that. Just thanks very much for inviting me to this meeting. And I just want to, introduce myself because I'm not part of your group. And I come at this as a longtime journalist, reporter, now opinion writer. And so I look at all of this from a different perspective. And one thing that strikes me about this, the minutiae, the detail that you're going into when you discuss this the law of war manual and so on and so forth and the protocols, is that in the fog of a major conflict between superpowers or whatever, when countries say they're allowed to strike a reactor, a nuclear power plant, even if it's the law's caveated and to limit it to outgoing power lines, like Henry was suggesting, my feeling is that would give the other side a pretext to do more, and the public wouldn't be any the wiser. The public wouldn't understand all these details, and they just say, oh, the Americans started it, but they just did and the Americans would say, well, we just hit the outgoing power lines. We're not releasing radioactivity and so on and so forth. But before that happens, the other side attacks one of our power plants and releases radioactivity. And all of that is going to get lost. All these detailed legal niceties are going to get lost in a situation like that. And I'd like both of you, Henry and Gary, to address that, because I don't see how we can call ourselves, an exceptional nation and a moral force when we have a law that and a viewpoint that justifies this on the basis that it allows us to stop nascent nuclear power programs. I'm as worried about nascent nuclear power programs as anybody else, but presumably we have other means to get rid of reactors than to bomb them and possibly harm civilians. So I wanted to raise that. I'm also a little bit skeptical of precision targeting and its accuracy in 100% of the cases, because wars are full of examples of targets being missed when they shouldn't have been, and so on and so forth. But I'll leave it at that because I'm not an expert on war and targeting. But I wanted to raise those sort of public image questions and just the moral side of this.
Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank you.
Go ahead.
I think you're raising an important point. I think we need to move the needle, and that was the point of the presentation I gave, to at least make it clear that we're not encouraging or leaving open options that would make someone believe that we want to go for the thickest part of the fence and actually run the risk of releasing dangerous forces. I think by preserving the options to do that, we've gone a little too far. I think we can maintain the ability in some circumstances to do that if there's high enough political authority willing to risk their career on it. But right now, I think it's too far in the direction of giving the impression that we're eager to do this, which I know, and Gary has made clear, we're not. Right. So with regard to, well, gee, then you shouldn't hit anything that, even if it doesn't release dangerous forces, because, well, that'll be a pretext. I'm sorry. I think protecting these plants when they're being used to make nuclear weapons materials or sending electricity, let's say, to air defense radars or a major military base, you got to leave open the ability to disable them. And I think also there is a Protocol 1 requirement that countries that have these things arrange them in such a way that the release of dangerous forces is less likely. We are not doing very much, and other countries are not doing very much to increase the resilience, if you will, against the release of dangerous forces. None of these things have air defenses around them. None of them are really hardened, particularly against military assault. You can change that.
Yeah.
I think, in other words, getting total relief and a clear moral sheet may not be in the cards, but I think we can do better, and that was the spirit in which I made the recommendations I did.
Gary.
Yeah, so a couple of things. I certainly don't disagree that we have to always be careful about what we're projecting, although I don't give as much credence. There's definitely lawfare that gets played. Our adversaries will do it. Russia's been doing it. They'll try and project in the things they're doing wrong and claim that others are the guilty parties. But you have to be very careful about what you set out as a matter of law versus policy decisions and policy positions, and then how to manage those policy decisions in ways that don't necessarily communicate too loudly to your adversary where your red lines are and where they aren't. So, just as a matter of law, so this is like Henry and I, honestly, we don't disagree that this should be a high level decision. My experience is it already is, and it would be. However, that's a policy question, not appropriate for writing into a legal manual that would say you must reserve this to the highest levels.
I don't think I said must. I said it
Well,
should.
but yeah,
It's
but
not
I mean,
even present.
Henry,
It's not even present.
Henry, let
Yeah.
please
You've
let Gary
acknowledged-
finish.
yeah, you've already acknowledged that the option should remain. It should be at a high political level to make the decision. If it is in fact a matter of a legal obligation not to do it, you're putting that high political individual in the situation of having to either breach international law, which is a reality at times, but that's, if it's a legal obligation, it's a legal obligation. It's not we just should have higher level people making the decision. And my only other point to that is, you can't predict the nature of every conflict. I've seen this in practice where, and we are presently trying to reorient our forces and our thinking as we look across over the horizon at the potential near peer competitors that we have. The types of policy restrictions and limitations that we had in place in Iraq and Afghanistan, appropriate in those environments, would not work in an environment with a near peer competitor. There are times when you must assume more risk and provide more delegation down to your professionals that have to make very quick battlefield determinations. Now, I'm not saying let all the privates out there make determinations about nuclear facilities. I'm just saying you have to preserve that flexibility. The last thing is, if a facility is involved in the production of nuclear weaponry, it would lose its protected status anyway. It's not an exclusive.
You and I agree on that.
Yeah,
I mean, it's,
okay.
we agree
Let
on
me-
that, but it
let
was
me
an
move
argument
on.
made that
Let me
that
move
was a
on.
problem with the protocol.
I love hearing agreement. Let me
Yeah.
move on to the two people who have questions remaining, which is Scott and Nicholas. Scott, ask your question. Nicholas, ask your question. Because given the locationness of the speakers, I don't want them to filibuster you out. So, Scott, please pose your question, and then Nick afterwards pose it, and then the speakers will respond. Scott.
Sure. Thanks for an interesting conversation. There's been an interesting set of topics to dig into. It strikes me, I think we're talking a little bit past each other a little bit on an objectives in this. A little bit as a framing issue here. I strike me that I think, Gary, your main concern, which I think is a reasonable one, and certainly the one motivating a lot of Department of Defense thinking around this, is concern about adopting unwarranted, not necessarily as we think reflecting customary international law, and unwise restrictions that might have undue ramifications in a future conflict, however unlikely that may seem. Maintaining maximum military flexibility, understandable motivation, very common, certainly Department of Defense posture. I say as a former State Department lawyer who sometimes has wrestled with that in other contexts, but understandable and not unfamiliar. Henry, you're framing your critique here as one of U.S. policy. Frankly, your motivation really seems much more to say, I want to have a tool with which I can more effectively critique Russia and other actors, both perhaps constraining us in a future conflict, but not necessarily in ways that we think the United States is very likely to pursue because of our view of our policy equities or the way we do tend to view these things. Is more about saying, here's where the United States is adopting a high standard, and we expect other peer states to adopt that. It strikes me you can do a lot with that within the legal constraints we have, and there's space to do that even in ways that could fit in the Law of War Manual. I mean, the Law of War Manual does have spots where we say there are presumptions that should be applied because of these weighing legal equities and legal structures, right? Like distinction itself is essentially a legal presumption, more rooted in CIL, but nonetheless one that is, the presumption is an instrumental tool for achieving your international legal obligations. And I could imagine, frankly, you could set up a statement that lays out, given the extreme conditions inherent in something like a nuclear facility, the extreme risks to civilians, the obvious major implications of things like civilian costs, that there is an expectation that there be certain weighing of considerations in terms of determinations made about the actual military necessity, the scale of military necessity, a presumption that they are not legitimate military targets unless there's a showing of major, significant, whatever adjective you want to describe, military necessity that outweighs the clear risk to civilian costs that this entails. You couldn't say it categorically for the reasons Gary notes, because we wouldn't want to rule that out. But I don't think it'd be hard to square a statement like that with how the United States actually thinks about that. And so I think there is that sort of middle ground there. Maybe the Law of War Manual is the right place to do it. Maybe it isn't. Certainly statements like this we've seen in other contexts, like, you know, our whole kind of mixture of law and policy and around a lot of counterterrorism policies does a similar thing. You could see a similar approach here. And I will say, Gary, actually, I think your point on the shift in European conflict is really actually prescient here, but actually I would take it in another direction. At the same time, while you are correct, the United States has to think about entering into conflicts where these may be strategic goals or strategic implications on our targeting context. We are also facing an era where we are facing rivals that we have to think about how they will approach these same targets and have the concerns about that. And that itself can be as much of an argument for laying out frameworks that have an element of constraint as resisting that element of constraint. It's a balancing act. I think you know that. I'm just laying that out there to say I think that's actually a little bit of a double-edged sword, that shift, which is very real and something we should think about in this context. So I just note that as a possible way forward, maybe a little bit more of a middle ground.
Great to thank you.
Two-finger response to that. I don't disagree with you, although I don't, again, put much faith in the likely adversaries, that they'll constrain themselves anyway. I mean, we see this with Russia. They're a party to the strictest standard known to law, which is Article 56, and it means nothing to them. And so there is value in a policy framework that messages our approach to this and our restraint. I don't disagree, but I don't think it's for the reason you said at the end, which would put some constraining deterrent on our adversaries.
Can I just do a 10-second?
Yes, and then we'll get Nicholas. Great, go ahead, Scott.
I'll say I don't agree with that, but we have to bear in mind when we're talking about constraints, we're not talking about influencing the direct behavior of the other party. More often we're talking about signaling permissive structures and aligning coalitions of other parties to condemn and perhaps even join, for example, the imposition of sanctions because of behavior. So if you can convince India it's bad for Russia not to do this, that's still strategically valuable. So that's more what I'm envisioning, less that Russia or China will suddenly come around with this view. There's a whole international community you want to get on board, and these things can be useful for that.
Yeah, Scott, I think your target is the concept of legitimacy with potential allies to be able to justify sort of
one way to frame it.
Exactly. So, Nicholas, I'm going to give you. There's no one else has their hand up, so you have the floor, and we have about 10 minutes left. Go ahead.
I will be as fast as possible. First, this has been a really excellent conversation, and thank you all. And we've covered so many different issues. It will explain why my thoughts, notes, and questions are all over the place a little bit, because there have been so many different ideas from different perspectives. So just some things that have occurred to me as I've been listening to the conversation. With regard to where the decision gets made in terms of attacking a nuclear facility, we have a model in nuclear weapons where authority for use is above the DoD level, and I guess there's for good reason, and I guess there's a question of whether is that a potential model, and there's also been debates in at least in the policy world as to who exactly should be involved in that decision, whether there should be legal requirements around it. And I realize there's a whole big constitutional debate around that as well. But maybe this is an area where that type of discussion needs to needs to happen. I also wonder about, we're focusing on one specific area of international law, Protocol 1, but there are also other sort of broader, maybe less legal, but more in spirit implications for regarding treaties that the United States is party to. So what, how does this impact Article 4 of, U.S. obligations under Article 4 of the NPT, or for other countries, their ability to implement, or I guess in U.S. interests, undermining implementation of treaties that we support, like the Amended Convention on the Physical Protection of Nuclear Material or the International Convention on the Suppression of Acts of Nuclear Terrorism, both of which are focused on non-state actors, but the implementation certainly requires state participation. Sorry, I'm going to switch to a completely different topic that was discussed earlier. I think this idea of special status is interesting, and the idea that popped into my head is you can't target civilians. I mean, that's already against the law. But what about the POWs that were captured by Russia protecting civilian nuclear facilities in Ukraine? They arguably have sort of a gray area status where they might neither be military combatants or civilians. How might they be treated when they may not be necessarily military troops, they might be contractors whose job it is to protect the civilian facilities. So what would international law say about what happens to them in that in that situation? And then the last thing that I wanted to mention is that there's, when I think about sort of the implications of this conversation, I'm thinking about ultimately what are the policy goals that are at least that I'm interested in here. And what I think about is the future where we may have many more reactors. And, ultimately, do we want to have a future with many more reactors where the norms, for attacking nuclear facilities are weaker? Or do we need stronger norms for attacking those facilities? Or against attacking those facilities rather, and then what tools do we need to achieve that? So obviously, national policy is one way of doing it. Another one that I would mention is existing regional agreements. One that I find interesting is the Pelindaba Treaty in Africa that explicitly requires its participants to not to attack civilian nuclear facilities. So I think there are a number of different models for this. I realize that's a little bit outside the scope for this conversation, but
thank you, Nick. No, I think it raises a lot of interesting issues. I'll let Gary go first, and then Henry, I'll let you sum up for the evening and respond to the issues.
Okay.
And then sum up. Gary.
Yeah, I mean, the other international legal obligations you'd have to look at, right? So, but this is a discussion framed around, at least at the outset, Additional Protocol 1 and the U.S.'s position with respect to Additional Protocol 1, specifically Article 56. When it comes to, I wasn't quite following on the status of personnel. I mean, if you have an international armed conflict, effectively you only have limited statuses for personnel. You have combatants who can be targeted and if captured are entitled to be treated as prisoners of war with special protections, release upon the end of the conflict, etc. You have civilians. Civilians are protected from being made the object of attack unless they engage in hostilities themselves. And they have a whole series of special, treatment regimes for how you handle civilians. The non-combatants that I mentioned earlier, and the levée en masse, which is, again, very, very unusual circumstance where civilians are entitled to be treated as prisoners of war, even though they're not combatants. So contractors accompanying the force may be entitled to be treated as prisoners of war, they're not entitled to engage directly in hostilities because they are civilian contractors. That's a special circumstance. But by virtue of the support they're providing, they can be targeted in many circumstances. So if you're talking about the personnel that work at the plant, when when Russia takes control of that plant, if it does, there may be other obligations that kick in under the law of occupation, and how you treat those civilian workers, whether you can force them to work in support of your war effort, et cetera, et cetera. But generally, continuing to run the plant probably wouldn't run afoul of those obligations.
Thanks. I think that's the point that I think Marianne was trying to make. Should there be a special status so the plant is not at risk as a result? And as you said, it may fall under occupation law. So Henry, you have the last word, and then we'll close up for the evening.
I think the Ukraine war has put a spotlight on something last thought about with any energy level about 36 years ago. We need to wire brush, I think, as Mr. Anderson or Scott pointed out, at least what our presumptions are. I think, in addition, I have a different take on what it means to sign an agreement. You really shouldn't be doing anything that suggests you're going to leave it unless you say you're going to leave it. And you shouldn't do anything to undermine it. And I think that ought to weigh a little bit more in our calculations as we articulate what we make of things, as I think we need to update what the presumptions are, as Scott laid them out. You know, what should the presumptions, how should we interpret, you know, these laws on the one hand, and where does the law not help us and we need to have policy? I think by doing that, you're going to get more of attention to the policy. Two other things. I think the one thing that came out in tonight's discussion is, what does it mean to target a plant? Probably would be useful to get into a little. Where we do it, I don't know. But I think the idea that we keep all of that classified is not even a half thought. I think there needs to be some public discussion of how you can disable without release of radiation. And there are a number of ways to do it. I think not clarifying that and assuming it's taken care of will probably be a mistake. And certainly, if we're going to have closing of ranks with our allies on our understanding both before and during a war, this is something that should be a matter of some discussion at conferences where there is nothing right now. By raising the political level for the decision, which is a point that Nick raised, I think that also would be helpful in getting people to think about, well, what are the implications of the release? I don't think we've thought enough about that. Finally, the question for the group is, are we going to try to do anything more than this one session? And I don't have any clear thoughts on this. But if we don't, we'll just say, oh, well, this was a very complicated matter that people will ignore and we don't have to worry about it. I think that would be a mistake because, as was pointed out, this is not the last war where these things are going to be targeted. And the issues of dealing with allies and how you manage the risk associated with all this is going to come up, and even some legal issues potentially. So I don't know. I'm curious to get what other people think on that front.
Thank you. We'll end on that, but I think what I'd like to do is, well, I'm sure between ABA and NPEC we'll have a summary of the discussion. I think we'd like to turn that, I think, Henry, into a point paper for the summary of the discussion. And then I think what we should do is circulate that and maybe generate the next step forward, which is the Gary Corrins and the Rengatis. Would they be interested in thinking through if there's going to be more modification of the law of armed conflict, what it should look like, and or where should some of these issues be placed either in a policy paper
Yeah.
or not necessarily in the LOAC manual. But I think all of us, given the fact you all stayed here for an hour and a half to
No
discuss
one left but Ben.
a rather arcane subject to many of us, demonstrates the interest and significance. And I'll end with, Henry, why it's significant is, as you started with your war game, the Europeans said clear war criminal, and the Americans were like, not so fast. So that's a very awkward situation.
It's very bad.
Right? Given where we are, given what kind of moral superiority we want to have, or moral clarity, is the idea, if Putin was listening going, oh, the Americans don't think it's a problem, that's great. I've got a green light now, which would be very concerning, as both Scott and Nick raised. And I think Marianne's point of, let's think about this a little bit hard about should there be special status and how. So with that, let me thank you all for a fascinating discussion.
Okay.
We'll get the point paper, and we'll hope to sort of circulate it, and we'll see. We'll get together, Henry, and decide what the next steps are between the organization.
I want to thank everyone for coming.
Yeah.
It's quite an interesting group of people.